The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to leach all the color from my world, a stark contrast to the raging storm inside me. I lay there, weak, wired to machines that beeped a relentless hollow rhythm, their insistent electronic pulse a constant reminder of my fragility, and listened as the words, delivered with a chilling practicality that sliced through the antiseptic air, landed like blows. Honestly, at this point, he's not worth the expense. Not worth saving. The sentiment wasn't directed at me, not exactly, but at the husk of a person I'd become, the financial liability, a number on a balance sheet rather than a beloved son. It came from her, my mother, a woman whose love had always felt conditional, a currency I'd perpetually struggled to earn, each transaction meticulously tallied in her unspoken ledger. And then the follow-up delivered with the same dispassionate tone, as if discussing a faulty appliance. I've told them to stop the payments. We can't keep bleeding money on this. My world, already teetering on the precipice of despair, fractured into a million irreparable pieces. The decision hadn't been mine, not truly. I'd fallen metaphorically and then, spectacularly, physically. A series of bad choices, a cascade of impulsive decisions, compounded by an even worse accident, had landed me here, staring down a mountain of medical bills that seemed to grow taller with each passing hour and a prognosis that felt more like a sentence than a medical assessment. I'd always been the fixer, the one who smoothed things over, who absorbed the blows for the sake of family peace, the buffer against any perceived discord. But this time the blows had been too much, too relentless. The doctors, with their earnest but ultimately pragmatic pronouncements, had offered a path, a treatment that held a sliver of hope, a chance to reclaim some semblance of my former self, a whisper of the life I'd once known. It was expensive, yes, undeniably so, but it was hope. And that was something she deemed too costly, a luxury too extravagant for her carefully managed finances. For weeks, I'd been a phantom in my own life, a spectral presence in the hushed corridors of the hospital, barely coherent, dependent on the kindness of strangers, the nurses, the orderlies, the fleeting visitors with their forced smiles, and the dwindling good graces of my family. My father, a man perpetually cowed by my mother's formidable will, a shadow of a man whose own opinions were often swallowed by her pronouncements, offered quiet sympathy, a gentle squeeze of my hand, but little else of substance. My siblings, each absorbed in the whirlwind of their own lives, their careers, their burgeoning families, sent superficial texts and promised visits that often evaporated like mist on a sunny morning, leaving behind only the faintest memory of their intention. It was my mother, the matriarch, the one who'd always orchestrated our lives with an iron fist clad in velvet, who held the reins, the conductor of our familial orchestra. And now she'd decided to let go of the reins, or rather, to cut the lifeline that tethered me to the possibility of recovery. The days blurred, a monotonous sequence of waking, enduring, and sleeping. I was transferred not to a more specialized care facility, a place where my complex needs might be met with dedicated expertise, but to a transitional ward, a holding pen, a liminal space where my continued existence was less an investment in recovery and more a logistical problem to be managed, a temporary inconvenience. The air was thick with the pervasive scent of disinfectant, a sterile attempt to mask the underlying smell of decay and unspoken resignation. It was here, surrounded by others whose stories were etched onto their tired faces, in their vacant stares and their resigned sighs, that the anger began to simmer, not a fiery, destructive rage that consumed everything in its path, but a cold, calculating ember, a quiet, persistent heat that warmed me from the inside. I was left to navigate the labyrinth of insurance rejections, the relentless calls from collections agencies, and the crushing weight of knowing that the person who had birthed me, who had carried me, had deemed me a lost cause, a burden too heavy to bear. I remember watching the nurses, their faces a mixture of weary professionalism and genuine compassion, their movements efficient yet gentle, and realizing, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that I was utterly alone in this fight. My mother's pronouncements had created a vacuum, an emotional and practical void, and the world, it seemed, was happy to let me fall into it, to tumble into the abyss of uncertainty and helplessness. They'd stopped the payments. This meant the treatments, the very things that offered a tangible possibility of recovery, of rebuilding what had been broken, were no longer accessible, no longer within reach. It was a deliberate act. Severance, a conscious decision to pull the plug on hope. And while I couldn't physically retaliate, while I had no leverage, no power, no voice that carried weight in her world, I understood something profound in that moment, a revelation that settled deep within my bones. Power wasn't always about shouting the loudest or wielding the biggest stick. Sometimes it was about knowing things, about seeing the cracks in the facade, the fissures in the carefully constructed edifice of her public persona. I spent my time observing, a silent spectator in the grand theater of the hospital, an unexpected anthropologist of human frailty and familial dynamics. I listened to the hushed conversations between doctors and anxious families, their whispered hopes and their quiet fears. I paid attention to the paperwork that floated in and out of rooms, the charts, the bills, the insurance forms, each a tiny piece of a much larger, more complex puzzle. I learned about the intricate, often predatory, dance between healthcare providers and insurance companies, the subtle negotiations, the calculated denials, the endless bureaucracy. I saw how quickly a life could be devalued, reduced to a ledger entry, a line item on a profit and loss statement. And I saw my mother's unwavering belief in her own righteousness, her absolute certainty that she was making the sensible, the correct decision, a decision born of logic and fiscal responsibility, rather than of love or empathy. It wasn't long before I started to piece things together, like a detective meticulously assembling clues. My mother, always meticulously put together, always projecting an image of effortless success and unwavering financial stability, had a secret, a carefully guarded truth that lay beneath the polished surface. It wasn't a grand, scandalous affair or a hidden addiction, but a subtle, calculated deception woven into the very fabric of her public persona, a constant performance of solvency. She'd been using funds that were technically earmarked for specific household expenses, for the practical necessities of our lives, to maintain a certain lifestyle, a lifestyle far beyond our actual verifiable means. There were expensive dinners at restaurants that charged by the ounce, luxury goods that whispered of status and exclusivity, little indulgences that she'd always justified as necessary for her social standing or her networking, essential tools for her continued ascent. I'd always dismissed it, chalked it up to her particular brand of materialism, her unwavering belief in the power of appearances. But now, with the stark reality of my own medical bills looming like a storm cloud, these little expenses, these seemingly innocuous purchases, felt like a betrayal of a far deeper magnitude, a squandering of resources that could have, and should have been directed towards my survival. The turning point wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap of revelation. There was no sudden epiphany, no burst of righteous fury that shook the foundations of my being. It was a slow dawning realization, a quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't about me being not worth saving in a medical sense, but about her prioritizing her own carefully constructed illusion, her meticulously crafted image of prosperity, over her son's well-being, over his very life. The financial strain she spoke of, the desperate plea of impending ruin, was a consequence of her own choices, not mine, a self-inflicted wound born of vanity and misplaced priorities. She was bleeding money, yes, but it was her own mismanagement, her own extravagance that was the source of the hemorrhaging, not my illness. I had nothing to lose. My reputation, at least in her eyes, was already in tatters, my physical health precarious, my future uncertain. What I did have, however, was time to heal, time to think, time to observe, and a mind that, despite the trauma, despite the physical and emotional toll, was still sharp, still capable of observation and deduction. I started to gather evidence, not actively seeking it out, not embarking on a clandestine investigation, but noticing, absorbing the details that were inadvertently presented. A misplaced receipt found tucked away in a purse, a hushed phone call overheard through a thin wall, a casual mention of a recent purchase that didn't align with her supposed budget, a discrepancy between her words and her actions. I wasn't building a case for court, or even for a public shaming, though the thought flickered occasionally. I was building a quiet understanding for myself, a bedrock of truth upon which I could stand, a foundation of self-knowledge that no one, not even my mother, could shake. When I was finally discharged, a fragile but determined figure, my body still protesting with every movement, my spirit weary but resolute, I didn't confront her. I didn't scream or demand an explanation, didn't engage in the dramatic confrontation she might have expected or then perhaps secretly craved. I simply observed the carefully orchestrated relief on her face, the way she quickly shifted the conversation to my progress, and the difficult decisions she'd had to make, the subtle attempts to reclaim her narrative. I went home, not to my old room, the sanctuary of my childhood, but to a small rented space deliberately distanced, a physical manifestation of the emotional chasm that had opened between us. The real work, the subtler, more insidious form of reclamation, began in the quiet solitude of my new life, a life stripped bare of the familiar comforts and the stifling expectations. I started to reconnect with people from my past, not to solicit sympathy or pity, not to paint myself as a victim, but to let the truth surface organically, like a seed pushing through concrete. I spoke to old friends, former colleagues, even some distant relatives, people who had known me and known my mother for years, not in accusatory tones but in a matter-of-fact way. I'd mentioned my medical situation, the unexpected expenses that had blindsided me, the prolonged period of incapacitation, and then with a subtle shift in my tone, a delicate modulation of my voice, I'd allude to the financial pressures that had made treatment difficult, the unexpected limitations that had complicated my recovery. The key was to be vague, to hint at burdens that were clearly not my fault, to suggest a narrative of hardship without explicitly stating the cause. The ripple effect was slow, almost imperceptible at first, but profound in its cumulative impact. People who had always seen my mother as the epitome of a successful, financially secure woman, the paragon of domestic and professional achievement, began to notice discrepancies, to question the narrative they had been presented with for so long. Whispers started, hushed conversations in hushed tones at social gatherings, in the aisles of the grocery store, over coffee. She's always seemed so put together, so in control, but is everything really as it seems? I heard he had a really tough time with his medical bills, and she was less than helpful. It's strange, given how well off they always appeared. The carefully curated image, the glossy veneer of her public persona, began to fray at the edges, revealing the imperfections beneath. Then came the social events, the opulent parties, the elegant dinners, the charity galas where my mother thrived, where she basked in the admiration of her peers, where her carefully constructed world was on full display. I attended a few, not to engage, not to confront, but to be present, to serve as a quiet, living testament to her choices. I'd politely acknowledge her, offer a brief, cordial greeting, a polite nod, and then move on, leaving her to navigate the inevitable questions that would inevitably arise. I wouldn't offer details, no juicy gossip, just a weary sigh and a comment about how things have been complicated financially, a seemingly innocent observation that carried the weight of unspoken implications. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension. The woman who presented herself as financially astute, who always had the latest designer bag, the most exclusive vacation, had apparently failed to provide for her own son during a critical time, a time when he was most vulnerable. The real impact wasn't in her public humiliation, not in a theatrical breakdown or a dramatic denouncement. It was in the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in how people perceived her. The unwavering admiration began to wane, replaced by a subtle, uncomfortable curiosity, a flicker of doubt in their eyes. Conversations that had once revolved around her accomplishments, her business acumen, her impeccable taste, started to subtly steer towards the perceived lack of familial support, the strange absence of concern for her own flesh and blood. Her carefully constructed world, built on appearances and the illusion of financial stability, began to show the strain, the foundations cracking under the pressure of whispered doubts and unspoken questions. One evening at a mutual acquaintance's dinner party, a gathering brimming with the city's elite, I saw it, a subtle but undeniable shift in the social dynamic. My mother, usually the magnetic center of attention, the woman whose every word was met with rapt attention, was relegated to the periphery, her usual radiance dimmed. The conversations around her were polite but distant, the engagement lacking its usual fervor. I saw the subtle glances, the almost imperceptible shift of eyes, the way people's gazes flickered towards me when she spoke about her own achievements, her latest philanthropic endeavor. It wasn't overt judgment, not a public condemnation, but a quiet reassessment, a recalibration of her standing. The legend of the capable, benevolent matriarch, the woman who seemingly had it all, had been quietly, irrevocably tarnished. She tried to brush it off, to regain her footing, to talk about her latest charity work, her boundless generosity, but the energy had shifted, the magic had dissipated. The belief, the unquestioning admiration was gone, replaced by a cautious skepticism. She never confronted me directly. We maintained a strained, polite distance, a silent truce brokered by mutual discomfort and the unspoken understanding of the damage done. The payments for my treatment were eventually reinstated, not by her, not with any acknowledgement of her past actions, but from a less visible source, a quiet intervention by someone who had heard enough, who had seen enough to understand the truth of the situation. My mother, it turned out, was far more concerned with her reputation, with the preservation of her carefully crafted image, than with the truth of her actions or the well-being of her son. The quiet revenge for me wasn't about causing her pain, not about inflicting upon her the same emotional torment she had inflicted upon me. It was about exposing the hollowness of her actions, about letting the natural consequences of her choices unfold, like a slow-burning fuse. It was about reclaiming my own worth, not by her validation, not by her belated apology, but by living my truth, by standing firm in my own reality, even when she had tried to write me off, to erase me from the ledger. The silence, in the end, the quiet refusal to engage in her games, was the loudest statement, the most powerful testament to my own resilience.